over to you. Thank you, Carolyn.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you, Rachel, for the warm welcome and introduction. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge those attending today. I'm still aware that teaching is very, very busy, if not busier and more demanding on your time, and a special acknowledgement to Associate Professor Michael Barber, who is joining us from Touro University in California. I wasn't quite sure, I didn't see, Rachel, whether Michael has joined us yet, but if you have, kia ora, Michael.
He's not in the room, but be assured that he'll be listening to you asynchronously if he's not here right now.
Oh, kia ora, Michael. As my research has shown, it's really important for us as kaiako to share about ourselves, especially if we want our ākonga to share about themselves. So I thought I'd start with sharing who I am, where I come from, and the context of this research. I'll then discuss how I carried the research out, share the findings, along with offering some advice from my own experience for future researchers when involving Māori participants. Because we need more research carried out in this online space and what works best for not only ākonga Māori but all ākonga. So hopefully there'll be some time left to answer my questions at the end. So as Rachel has already shared in the blurb that went out inviting you to attend, she shared with you that I've been involved in online teaching and learning for the last 2 decades. And I've actually been teaching for the last 4 decades. And during that time, I've been known by several names. I started my teaching as Carolyn Alexander, married and became Carolyn Bennett, divorced and became Carolyn Alexander again, and now I have remarried and Carolyn Rood is my name. However, most of my ākonga online students tend to call me Carolyn or Miss. So kia ora koutou anō. Ko whakataha te maunga, ko waitangi te awa, ko tauwhara te marae, ko Ngāti Rihia te whiu ngā hapu, ko Ngāti Rihia te whiu ngā, ko Ngāpui te iwi, ko mā tātua te waka, e noho ana ahau ki Ruakaka, te tai tokorau, Aotearoa New Zealand, ko Carolyn Alexander ahau. So no research has all the answers. I just want to put that out there. And the context of this research is really important to note because participants were already familiar with learning or teaching online. So the study applied Kaupapa Māori methodologies to explore virtual learning communities with the aim to establish effective pedagogies to engage and support ākonga Māori, particularly when learning online. The study utilised a qualitative research method through a case study to explore what the current pedagogies were being used by eTeachers, eDeans and eStudents in one region of Aotearoa, and that was in Tai Tokerau. So the context of the study involved kaiako, ākonga and tūmawaki, specifically involved with Whānau, which is a cluster, for those who don't know, and it's always changing, but it's a cluster of schools based in Te Tai Tokerau mainly and currently associated with the online learning community. So it's important to discuss what I did, who was involved, how and when it occurred. So the data was gathered through semi-structured interviews with 8 schools and 19 participants who were interviewed through 2 phases. Phase 1 involved individual interviews with the leaders and teachers who were referred to as tūmawaki and kaiako. Phase 2 involved focus group and individual interviews with learners referred to as ākonga Māori. Their kōrero was recorded, transcribed and thematically analysed. So the study was obviously undertaken during a time when the world was experiencing a pandemic. And so for many kura in Aotearoa New Zealand, their students went from home for over 100 days straight during that lockdown period. And during 2022, this year, kura have been required to adopt a more hybrid approach with a mixture of kaiako and ākonga isolating at home, as you are well aware. And it's still happening. where kura are still open. So in addressing these changing and challenging times in education, the research attempted to capture stories of the experiences of those tūmawaki, the kaiko, the ākonga Māori and the kura, as they have needed to adjust to the requirements of an emergency teaching and learning, emergency remote teaching and learning. So although that planning and seeking the ethical approval for undertaking the research I was involved with, it actually began well before COVID. So initially it was really difficult for me to identify the themes that were emerging, and I had lots of data. I had lots of narrative, and I found it really difficult to identify what the themes were. And I think it was because I was looking from a te ao Pākehā lens. And so as soon as, and I talk about how I went back and looked at the Kaupapa Māori principles throughout the journey. And when I revisited them one day, I realised that I needed to be looking at the data through a te ao Māori lens. And the moment I did that, it became really crystal clear that there were three overarching themes that were emerging. And that was around Whanaungatanga, the building of positive relationships, Kotahitanga, the working together respectfully, and the Manaakitanga, which is the caring, the mutual trust, respect and concern. And of course, no doubt, you'll be well aware of the meanings of these words from your own practices. So I want to share what the questions were, just to add to the context of the research. So firstly, the main question was, what effective pedagogies work well to engage and support ākonga Māori in an online environment? And I'd actually undertaken some research earlier, many years ago, actually, about 8 years ago, involved with Michael Barber. And I actually looked at, the participants were actually the teachers. So I never actually really talked to the students around what worked well. So I really wanted to make sure that this research had a lot of student agency, you know, the voice from the students. And so the second question was around whether online education actually provided equitable educational opportunities for ākonga Māori from rural New Zealand schools. And during the study, it became really clear that there was a definite disconnect between the pedagogical mode of online learning that we know, that we had been practicing, using, and the one that suddenly was thrust upon schools, which was referred to more as emergency remote learning, home learning. And a lot of people didn't see that disconnect because they didn't know, had nothing to compare it to. But for us, who'd been in that space for a long time, we did. So I added a question around how ready were schools for emergency remote learning. So what was interesting, I wanted to look at the effective strategies. So these are the effective strategies that came through. I don't think many of you would argue with them or even be surprised by them. They are strategies that we implement on a daily basis as practitioners with our face-to-face classes. They're strategies that have been well researched previously, and the research shows that they are still relevant. 20 years later, you know, we know that what's been said in the past is still relevant now, if not more relevant. But what was interesting, and I'd like to touch on some of these effective strategies individually, was that many of them were actually identified as effective strategies as long as the right factors were in place for kaiko to become effective online teachers. So many of them talked about knowing that these were, but they needed to make sure that there was a range of right factors that are in place in the school, in the classroom, in the receiving school space, so that kaiko are supported and ākonga are supported. Oh, I'll just refer to my notes back here. So I'd like to actually just go through each of these because I think they are important. Many of the strategies we are really well versed with. So what I did during the course gathering that data was to use the narratives from from participants, which actually I think gives that more, when you hear it raw, and these narratives are quite raw from what they said. So Kaiako communicated that a key strategy to use to engage ākonga in their classes was based around the building of positive relationships, with the emphasis on it being early in the year, and then maintaining those relationships during the year. So not just starting off with a Padlet and getting people to introduce themselves, but to actually be using it, going back and referring to what their interests are, where they're from, and finding out more about them. And one kaiako stressed that the relationship building needed to go further than just between the teachers and the students, but they needed to extend between the students and students in the class, and between the eTeachers and the eDeans, and to also include building relationships with whānau. Teachers talked a lot about professional development and the need for it. The research findings have supported inconsistencies still exist in professional development for online teaching and learning. However, Kaiako identified that the Ko Tui Tui Online Teachers Network has gone a long way to address the problem, with one tūmawaki explaining how the cluster was now involved with network, and it provided consistent professional development to eTeachers and eDeans, which extended during COVID to providing assistance to other schools that were thrown into emergency remote teaching. Knowing your student was really important. This principle shared the need to know your student, and added that kaiako needed to ask the following to truly appreciate and value the student, saying, what else does the teacher bring to what else does the teacher bring to extend the existing knowledge of the student, of the ākonga? And that it's important to ask yourself, how can I really help this child? What's my taonga? What's my gift that I can give to this child? And you must find out about the students, and then you find out what you can add to them individually. Meeting kanohi ki te kanohi, face to face. Several eTeachers and eDeans discussed the importance of having the time to think about effective strategies together to engage ākonga Māori. And unfortunately, identifying not having the time, as we know, to develop and design them. Because I was interviewing kaiako who had been on this journey of online teaching for several years, they discussed at the beginning of the online journey how important it was when we held ihuis at the beginning of the year, where students and teachers came together. And one non-Māori teacher actually discussed and shared that the Māori learners really benefited from meeting their online te reo Māori teachers, who had often travelled from the far north to the far south. And it gave ākonga Māori a sense of belonging, that they were part of something really big, something really exciting, and they got to spend the day with their teacher and with their fellow students. We know the use of te reo Māori is really important, and that was definitely recognised, identified by kaiako. And they stress that it shouldn't be something that they do just because they get told to by their kura, or because of an MOE initiative. They said that they wanted to normalise the use in the classroom. And it was also noted by kaiako the importance of knowing who the learners were in front of them, and knowing who the ākonga Māori students were, and not just identifying they've got dark skin, they've got dark hair, that maybe they are Māori. Do not assume also that ākonga Māori, were able to speak te reo. So once again, this was shared by a non-Māori participant. She said, my reo is limited, so I can't speak fluently to ākonga Māori, but I do try to incorporate greetings and any other general words that I know into my teaching. But more specifically, I try to find out where their interests lie. I would find the context that they have knowledge in, for example, kapahaka, wakaama, and apply that to the standards or to the learning to those in context. So communication tools obviously is an effective way, we know that, to engage with their students. And Kaiko felt it was important to involve ākonga in the decision as to what tools should be used, especially during asynchronous times. So not actually telling students, well, this is what I'm going to use, but to find out what is the space that the ākonga are in, you know, what are they using regularly so that they ensure that, you know, the communication was a strong tool and not just something that teachers thought that they were able to use. Being culturally responsive required teachers to show empathy and understanding. With one kaiko who came from a kura who had a high number of ākonga Māori, presented a te ao Māori view of what she felt worked well for ākonga. And she said, what our students like is if a teacher can articulate through the online screen their empathy and understanding their context without being patronising, without being condescending, because at the end of the day, whilst we are a decile one school, the teacher must see a person first and foremost and not base it on where they come from. And she also, in another teacher, Kaiko, acknowledged that the learner, for the person they, that same tūmawaki acknowledged that Kaiko must acknowledge the learner for the person that they are rather than for the stereotypes that are often said about my people. Teachers need to recognise that ākonga Māori can bring knowledge too, that, you know, they can bring mataranga, the knowledge with them, but as a teacher you must work out how to get that knowledge out of them. She also drew a connection with Māori around Matariki, which is Māori New Year. And she said that they believe that they are connected to the whenua, the land, that children go through a huge slump in May and June, which fits in line with winter, and in the end month that the whenua is shutting down and it is going into hibernation mode. And she shares her own experience as a student at school. She said, I felt like that as a teenager. I believed in Matariki time as it is the new year, and it has a physical change on your mind and it becomes clear, and that is the time when you set goals. I see that in our children, so that I do as a teacher. So what I do as a teacher is to say, that's okay, it's quite normal for you to feel quite heavy at the moment, feeling everything is on top of you. She also talked about the importance of te wā, allowing time, and how tono wā, which is literally means in his or in her time. So in the context of education, she discussed how time is a big deal, that you have to get things done on certain dates, and if you do not, that there are consequences. She talked about one of the consequences could be that our ākonga Māori actually fail, but that for Māori and for her as an educator, the challenge is to find a way to mitigate that situation so the students do not get themselves anxious. And she explained that one of the things that she found ākonga Māori really like is what she referred to as drifting assessment. You say an assessment is due on the 5th of April, but you keep it open for another 9 days. This is a very mature way to deal with assessment deadlines and dates. Ākonga Māori have a real thing about time, around Gregorian time, and around people's understanding of time. So that kind of really resonated with me. She discussed also how for ākonga Māori, they want things given to them straight away, but they also want the teacher to break down the big assessments and break them down into smaller blocks, citing that things can happen in their lives that prevent them from getting the assessment in on that first due date. And she said, as we know as adults, something always happens tomorrow, and then things happen that prevent tomorrow coming. So it's important to be mindful of that. with ākonga Māori too. They, referring to ākonga Māori, do not know how to burn the midnight oil. So what I say to students around wā, being time, is that I don't expect them to know this in February, but during the year, I would expect them to change. So moving on, this list was cross-referenced with what ākonga felt was engaging. So I asked kaiako, what do they do which actually ensures that ākonga are engaging? So so they've got quite a few things here. Use of te reo Māori, build positive relationships with eDeans, build positive relationships with e-students, get to know ākonga, give clear instructions, use communication tools, pronounce ākonga names correctly and make learning authentic, and finally individualise emails and wellbeing checks. And for many of us, we could just go around and go, yes, I do that, yes, I do that, or I might try to do that. So that's a list that that kaiako gave me, and then I cross-referenced it with what ākonga felt, and they agreed with that list as well. So I've chosen some narratives to share under the themes which develop, which many of you will resonate with, obviously. But for many of you, you may not realise that you might think, yes, that's what I do, but you may not link it at this stage to that theme of Whanaungatanga, of building. We talk about building and maintaining relationships, but that's what Whanaungatanga is all about. It's about knowing people, and ākonga discussed how they felt their eTeachers built their relationships with the following comments. The one student said, John always tries to get to know us. He checks up on our weekends as we see him twice a week. He doesn't just ask us what we did, but he remembers what we told him we did last week and talks about that. He shows he cares and he wants to get to know us. He also tells us about his weekends. A few more things that students have said. I think it is important to build relationships, but I also think that teachers need to ask us what our aims are for the year so that we can have shared expectations. My teacher at the beginning of the year went over what we had previously studied, what we know, what we don't know, and she went over the assessments and asked if there was anything we didn't know. This one I put in as well. I didn't feel like I had a good or bad relationship with my teacher. I just didn't really have a relationship. He was my teacher and he had a job to teach me, but it was also partly my fault as I didn't try to communicate with him either. But I feel that if he had sent out a survey at the beginning of the year to find out about us and to find out what we wanted to get out of the year, what my expectations are, and saying what his expectations are, then we are all on the same page. And finally, I personally found the relationship with my online teacher far healthier than my relationship with most face-to-face teachers, on the basis that there are so many barriers in the educational world. One of the reasons was that we had the ability to just text your teacher if you needed something, which was quite different to face-to-face classes. The second theme of, or another theme of Manaakitanga, the caring and respect, is around showing that hospitality and developing an ethic of care for others. It also refers to the nurturing school culture that values caring and respect, and it provides the foundation for success for all students. The same ethic of care and respect also applies to teachers and whānau. And ākonga shared how they felt the online kaiako genuinely cared for them and were happy to provide extra tutorials when they needed them. They discussed how their kaiako used several communication tools to keep in touch with them and encouraged them to keep in touch regularly with their kaiako as well. Finally, the findings. I see I've actually missed Kotahitanga out of that, but that's all right. But the major findings from the study actually indicate that teaching and learning online is complex, and it relies heavily on building positive relationships amongst all the participants in teaching and learning online. The importance of developing and maintaining these relationships to engage ākonga have been well researched in the traditional educational setting, but it's important to revisit the knowledge and lessons through the research to address the need to support further ākonga Māori who are going to be learning in this changing environment. The study also highlighted that with the right factors in place, that online education does provide equitable educational opportunities for ākonga Māori, and bearing in mind the tūmawaki who were asked and the kaiako who were asked in this study were from Whānau. When they were asked the question about how prepared were they or their schools to adopt emergency remote learning, they did say that they felt that they were far more prepared because as a result of their previous involvement with Whānau and the online learning community, and found that as teachers they were called upon to help a lot. This list is a very big list, and I'm not going to go through with you. As Rachel said, she will share the PowerPoint afterwards. But it's a big list for us just to look at, to think, yes, I do that. Oh, maybe I could do that better. Maybe I'm not sure how to do that, and find out how to do things. But it's also a list that you can look at and think, oh, I'd like to focus. I do that quite well, but maybe I don't do enough of that. And but it was, for me, I needed to put the whole list in just to share what was coming through from both kaiako and from the ākonga Māori as well. I've also added a couple of slides in discussing the Kaupapa Māori principles that I adopted to undertake the research, and to emphasise the importance that I believe a research undertaking research involving Māori students. And basically, as a researcher, it's imperative to ensure that the research is culturally safe. I was fortunate, I was able to whakapapa back to the area where the research was being undertaken. However, I was not at the time very confident in using a Kaupapa Māori methodology, and I found that during the research it was important to have someone as a bit of a mentor who was right up there and confident with Kaupapa Māori principles, who I could talk with and check that I was following, that I was being tika, correct in my cultural responsiveness, and to go back and revisit those steps. So I've just listed some Kaupapa Māori principles here, starting off with aroha ki te tangata, which allows people to define their own space and to meet in their own terms. So it's important when you're undertaking your research to find out where best to interview students. Kanohi ki te kanohi expresses the importance of meeting with people face to face. And of course, during COVID, it was very difficult and challenging to get into schools. So that's where the use of video conferencing was kanohi ki te kanohi. This was a really important one for me, te tero, whakarongo, kōrero. So it symbolises the process where the researcher's role is one of watching, one of listening, learning, and then waiting until it is appropriate to speak. Manaakitanga ki te tangata reinforces the view that research must be collaborative and reciprocal, a reciprocal process, and acknowledges that learning and expertise exist in both parties. Kia tūpata reminds a researcher to be politically astute, culturally safe, and reflexive about their insider-outsider status, to acknowledge there's lots of kawa and tikanga depending on where you are, to make sure that participants are willing to engage. Koe e takahia te mana o te tangata requires a researcher to sound out ideas with people, disseminating research findings and about community feedback. And kia nākau mihaka reminds the researcher to be humble in your approach. And when you look at those Kaupapa Māori principles, you could also look at those are some of the principles that can support our teaching practices as well. So my final thoughts, whilst this research commenced before the world was thrown into a pandemic, that the norm, I think it's important to remember that things are just going to continue to change. We started off, for those of us who've been teaching in an online space for a long time, suddenly that secret got out there and people started realizing that we would do what we were doing, and it's changing, and they need us to support them in making sure that what we're doing and which is based on good sound pedagogical approach, can actually be applied through the hybrid learning, and through, well, we've really shifted from remote learning to a hybrid approach. And of course, Derek speaks a lot about that in his blogs, and also to make sure that we address those equitable opportunities. In closing, just share this last comment from one of my students, or sorry, not one of my students, but one of the ākonga Māori students that I interviewed. He said that schools need to have an A plan. So the new direction for schools needs to be an A plan, and that's the hybrid learning. The online needs to be the A plan rather than the B plan. And we've now had plenty of time to think about that as well. I did notice in between taking my working on my PowerPoint earlier today and this afternoon, I have actually missed a slide out, which I'll add to with Rachel. But it was sorry, I've got to grab a bit. Another copy is happening. I also had looked at the dispositions of an e-student, which is in a slide, and those dispositions were around, and I don't know whether that word dispositions is the right word to use. I used it, but students talked about that they recognised they needed to be self-motivated. They needed to manage their time effectively. They needed to communicate. They needed to be systematic, resilient, responsible, organised, community-minded. And that's what came from them. So they were very mature in that approach. I also, in the thesis, created a list of dispositions of an eTeacher. And they were based around the different kaupapa of Whanaungatanga, Manaakitanga, and Kotahitanga. And we've got a few minutes. I'll just mention a couple, which is around building positive relationships, setting high expectations. These are all under Whanaungatanga. Being social, having an awareness of learning environment, being a good observer and listener, cultural awareness. Under Manaakitanga, you need to have empathy and understanding. You need to know your student. You need to be supportive of your students. You need to be patient and caring and showing genuine interest and caring for the performance of students, encouraging student feedback and discussions, and being culturally aware and being a learner yourself. And finally, under Kotahitanga theme, you need to be able to collaborate, be flexible and helpful, recognise the cultural capital that your students will bring to your class. You need to vary your teaching pedagogies, and you need to use authentic and local curriculum. And in that chart, I've got some narrative from both teachers, kaikoa, and students, ākonga Māori, to go with that. So, maururu koe ko mō te whai, wā ki te whakarongo ki taku whakatūranga. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I am happy to share the full thesis at any time. Kia ora koutou.